Hi folks, Mary Murphy from the Bristol School of Animation here, just going to go through a really simple technique for building a stop motion hand for a puppet. I'm just laying out the tools and materials that you're going to need to follow this bit of the tutorial just into frame. But underneath this little film you'll see a link, and that link will take you to a full list of the materials, the suppliers, and also any important health and safety information that you need to know. You'll also notice that central to the frame is a drawing, and this is quite a key concept in stop motion. We need to manage our building so that it comes in on scale. And I'm just opening up the wire, and you'll notice that the wire initially is quite kinky and quite bent. So I want to get that as smooth as possible because those little bends translate as weak spots on the armature. So a smooth wire will last a lot longer. So just smoothing it out, and you'll see it leaves a little bit of oxide. You want to keep your hands as clean as possible when you're working with wire. So the baby wipes are really important. Now I'm just making a loop here, and it's a bit difficult to explain what I'm doing, but in a second you'll see that all I've done is about sort of 3-4 inches up the wire. I've just made essentially a thumb, and you'll see I've left myself lots of extra wire because I can trim that, the same at the wrist. So for our first few hands we make everything a bit bigger than it needs to be, and we can trim it back to shape. So the next step is to make the index finger at right angles to the thumb. So as I'm twisting here, I'm pulling a little bit, and that tension gives me a nice even twist. And without worrying too much about measuring, I'm just going to make the remaining fingers all the same length because I know that they're all just a little bit longer than they need to be. It's very difficult to make something like this exactly the right size. So if you work a little bigger and trim it back, it saves a lot of time. You'll notice that the wire gets a little bent as you're working, so always a good idea to stop every now and then, straighten it out, put it back into shape, and just check against your scale drawing that you're still on model. And on model is a really key concept as well. It's keeping things consistent and the right size and shape. So obviously we need 2 hands, so we'll need both of those hands to be pretty much the same shape and the same size. So just pushing the wire into the right position, and that tells me that I'm nicely on track. And I need to think about the wrist. So there's 2 strands of wire in the fingers, but I want 3. The wrist will move in lots of different directions. Finger just really goes in one plane, but if a wrist moves around 360 degrees. So 3 strands of wire is going to give me a much stronger wrist, and it will make this arm and hand last a lot longer. So what I'm going to do is, I should have a short piece of wire and a long piece, and I just want to cut the long piece so it's about twice as long as the shorter piece. And just smoothing it out again, take every opportunity to just train that wire flat and get everything back into the right shape. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bend that longer piece of wire up and fold it back into what will be the palm of the hand. Now I'm going to overshoot, so you can see I'm just going to get a cocktail stick and just show you that little extra piece of wire there. Again, a lot easier to make it long and trim it back. So as I twist, you'll see that a little bit more clearly. So holding very tightly with my left hand, smoothing out my wire with my right, and pulling a little bit as I twist. So I'm putting a little bit of tension and twisting. And it's that tension and that really tight grip that means the wire will twist really nice and evenly. And you can see there it's progressing nicely. And now if I just bend that little tail out, you can see that's longer than it needs to be. You really want to get that sitting in what will be the center of the palm. So you don't want it ending at the wrist because then you've got 2 strands of wire rather than 3. So I'm just going to trim that and bend it back in with my nail, there we go, so that it's sitting in the center of that palm. And all of that section there in the center will be covered in milliput, which is that white, soft clay-like material. Again, you'll notice it will have gotten a little bent out of shape, so just putting it back into the right position helps me to see where I've gone wrong, if I have, and that's looking good. And what I want to do next is create that palm shape. So again, in the materials link, you'll see I put in how to mix milliput and what milliput is. So this has been mixed about 5 minutes ago, and I'm just going to make 2 small ball shapes. Now for this size hand, they're maybe peppercorn size, petit pois. You have to do it a few times to get it right, but I've just brought my baby wipe into the frame because my hands are going to get really sticky working with the milliput. So I've made 2 sort of tic-tac shapes, and I'm just pushing those onto the armature, one on either side of the palm. And I want to try and get this as flat as possible. My hands are getting a little sticky, so at this point, just take that tackiness down. Helps a lot. It helps to handle the milliput if your hands aren't building up that residue. And I want to flatten that palm section out. So I want to make it a broader shape, and I want the hand to be flat in profile. It just looks better on camera. It reads better on camera if the hand is flat. Now you can see that I'm still inside that shape. I want to try and get it as close to that shape as possible. For your first hand, it doesn't really matter what shape the palm is, but if you were making a puppet, you'd need to match the hand, and getting this shape right and attention to detail here will just help you to make pairs of matching hands without too much time wasted. So I'm just using my cocktail stick to just tidy up some of those little rough bits and just tucking it down around those wires. And there we have. My palm is in place, tidying it up and just checking again. And there we go. So I'm happy enough with that. If this was going to be cast, it's really important that stays within the framework of my scale drawing, because I run the risk of the mould not closing if the milliput's too big. So happy enough with that, and we'll move on to the next phase in about 2 hours. So 3 hours later, and I can now handle this quite easily because my milliput is rock hard. It feels a bit like porcelain or ceramic. And what I'm going to do next is trim the fingers down to the right length. It would have been quite difficult to do this while the milliput was still soft because I would likely have damaged it. So I've left it for 2 hours, and now I can get in with my snips. It's a bit of an awkward angle, but I'm privileging the camera so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm just cutting where my drawing indicates the fingers end. Now a good scale drawing should be really clear and easy to read, and this one is, so I can see very easily where to cut my fingers. With the arm, depending on how this would be attached to the rest of the puppet, you may have a very long arm or a very short wrist section. I'm going to cut it just a little bit longer than I need to, because it's useful to have something to hold on to for the rest of the process. And there we go, ready for the next step. For this next step, you are going to need a little piece of clay. So I'm using a bit of white tack here, but it could just as easily be plasticine. And some latex. Now again, if you go into the materials link, there's some information there about latex that you need to read. And you just need a small amount, because what we want to do is coat our armature in latex. It's really important that the armature has a layer of latex to help the skin to bind. Now you can paint this on with a paintbrush, but latex will destroy a paintbrush. So I tend to dip, and my little piece of putty is just to help me to hold on to that armature as I'm dipping, but also it gives me a little pedestal to stand it up on when it's drying. So in and out quite easily, and you just want to get one layer. And it's quite runny liquid, so you'll notice that the latex drips off, and you want to help that process along. Little blobs of latex on the ends of fingers can actually, if it dries at a funny angle, can cause the fingers to be slightly misshapen. So even using a cocktail stick just to kind of tickle the bits of latex off the end is quite advisable. And also any webbing, any little bits that sort of lodge between the fingers, you want to break the tension there and get it so you just have one nice clear layer, and you want to leave that standing up. You want the latex to run down the armature, down to the bit that you're going to cut off. So if I just take the latex out of the way, it's important to put the lid back on because it will dry in air. And again, a bit tricky to see under camera, but this is just standing up right now with all of that latex drying onto the armature. It does take about 20 minutes, half an hour for the latex to dry. So while that's drying, I'm just going to prep the skin for the next phase. What I need to do is to get myself some foam. Now this particular foam is called scrim, and again it's there's some information in the materials sheet. It's quite stretchy and it's about 2 millimeters thick. I'm going to bring my latex back in, and what I want to do is I want to dip the foam into the latex, and this is quite messy, so a baby wipe is quite useful to have handy, and just scrunch it up, dip it in, and give it a really good squeeze. And you want to get latex in over the entire surface. Now obviously it's a lot easier to do this in large pieces and cut them down, but just for the sake of this tutorial I've kept the pieces really small. And you'll notice there's a lot of bubbles coming out. That's a detergent that's in the latex, and that is pretty good. It always looks a little bit uneven where the latex is thick, but that doesn't matter. And just use your baby wipe just to get the latex off the skin, keep everything nice and clean. And it's worth mentioning at this point that the latex will contaminate your puppet. So little blobs that spill need to be cleaned up, but also as your hands dry the latex out, you get these little funny kind of gluey bits. Now those will contaminate back onto your surface of your puppet. So you need to be meticulously clean. The best way of doing it is to just rub your hands together over a dustbin and get all those little pieces off before you handle your puppet, because you will wind up transferring that, and because it's latex it will stick to the skin and you'll get a lumpy kind of a look on your surface. So just make sure that you're keeping all that really clean, so that's out of the way. And if you notice again the bubbles that are in the latex, this is a detergent that's used to wash the foam, and actually this will contaminate the latex. So I will always dip latex in a small container and just decant small amounts. I will keep that and I can continue to dip latex in that, but I wouldn't use that now for any other part of the puppet because it's sudsy. It's lost a little bit of its integrity. This has to be left to dry, and you'll see the difference. The piece on the left is a dry piece, so where it was a bit thick, it's a little bit yellow, but that's absolutely fine. If I touch the wet one, you'll see that the latex comes off in my hand. It's a kind of a milky colour, but where it's dry, it's completely safe to touch and I can handle it quite easily. Again, that's just where it's thick. The nice thing about this is that this will now stick to itself beautifully. It's really, really sticky, and it will stick and form a really permanent bond. And it's also kind of compressible. So if you look at where I have a double layer, where I'm squeezing, I'm compressing, and that will stay stuck. So it's quite a nice material to work with because you can almost sculpt it like clay around an armature. So the next step is to bring some pieces in. Now I've cut these to specific shapes, which will make a bit of sense when you've seen the end of the next process. But essentially these are the rough shapes that you're going to need in order to skin your puppet from this point. As we're beginning to talk about our skinning, it's worth mentioning that a good sharp scissors is your best friend. You can use an ordinary flat nail scissors. I particularly like one with a curved top on it. And we're going to be bringing back in the armature that has the latex, which is now dry. So it's gone clear. There's a slightly shiny coating on the armature, and I can remove the piece of plasticine from the bottom, and I'm ready to begin to skin. So we're going to bring in some of our skinning material pieces, and I've already cut them to the size that I'm going to need. And at this point, they just need to be bigger than the hand itself. So we're going to be making a kind of a sandwich with the hand in the middle. So the bigger pieces, I've got 4 of them here, we're going to put 2 layers of skin on. But I've also cut, these are usually offcuts that have come from a different project, but I've made some long skinny strips as well, and these will just about wrap around the wire on the wrist. The reason I've made these is that your wrist is a lot wider. If I just show you here, your wrist is a lot wider than your fingers, and even on a cartoon character, the wrist needs to read a lot wider than the fingers for it to be believable. So we need to bulk the wrist out a little bit before we start adding the outside layers of skin. So taking my little strip, I'm just going to wrap that, and you'll find that where you've painted latex on the wire first, it sticks beautifully. It's really quite a strong bond, and you can just wrap the foam around. Now this does take a bit of getting used to, but if it goes wrong, you can rip it off and try again. And I'm just pinching it closed, and the warmth from your fingers kind of helps to fuse that material together. So that's one layer, and I'm just taking my little extra piece off the end, just with my scissors. And it's still not quite wide enough, so I'm going to add another few layers. And again, offcuts work well, so you're not wasting the material if you use the pieces that are trimmed. So you'll notice that there are bags on the tables. What I'd like you to do is, as you're trimming pieces off, just keep them in those plastic bags, and I can reuse those for another workshop in a couple of weeks. And just another layer. Sorry, I've gone off camera here a little bit, but you get the idea. I'm just adding a couple of layers of bulk, and don't worry too much about seams because it's quite thick, this material. So once we add our top layer of skin, it covers a multitude of sins. But you can also squish down, so compressing down and getting right in with your fingernail just helps to neaten up that little join between the milliput and the foam. So just adding one more little layer just to even up that shape. And again, you can get really, really quite fine detail here where you take your time. So where you get good at this process, you can add in extra materials, colour, textural qualities that can really look good on camera. But for now, we're keeping it just a really simple cartoon shape. And I am now ready to start to add my outer skin. For the next stage of the process, you're going to need to get your scissors right in between these fingers to trim away this skin. So it's a good idea to just spread the fingers out a little bit, give you a little bit more space to be able to trim away that foam material. What we're going to do is place the armature in the center and put a piece of foam directly down over the top. And once it's sort of roughly in place, you can see it's sandwiched well in the middle of those two pieces. I'm just going to pinch with my fingers, and what you should see is that as that foam compresses and sticks, you start to see the profile of the armature coming through. So this is a very simple way of creating flexible shape. You can get really complicated with stop motion characters using molds with foam and latex, but this is a really, really simple way of making hands, and it's quite effective. When you're pinching, you need to go right in quite hard with your fingers and pinch right in against the armature. You're trying to really seal that shut all the way around. It's like vac forming almost, all the way up the wire and around the tips of the wire. Particularly pay attention to the spots between the fingers. When you trim this, if you get big gaps appearing, it's because you haven't pinched enough. So now that I'm ready to go, I'm just going to trim. And you'll notice that as I'm cutting, rather than just keeping going all the way around, I'll stop, flip the arm over and cut the easy bits first. Believe me when I tell you this is the easiest way of working. Take off that excess, so just go around the tops of the fingers, making sure I'm not too close to that wire. And I've made a kind of a paddle shape. And again, not making life too difficult for myself, but just trimming around. So that's a good process, is to get the arm clear first so that you can handle it, and then going around the fingers. And what I'd like you to notice is that I'm moving the armature as much as I'm moving the scissors. And I tend to go in one direction all the way around. And you'll notice that I struggle a bit. The tip of these scissors isn't very sharp, so I have to really work with the end of those scissors to get right in. And also notice that I'm not completely against the wire. I'm leaving a little bit of a seam. Remember that this stuff will squish down, so I can squash the seams down. So it's less important to be neat, and it's more important to leave a little bit of a seam so that my wire stays very safe and snuggled inside. It's also important not to pull. Cut right to the point rather than trying to pull out those little extra sections. Now, it's going to be very hard to cut that little piece. So remember that this is flexible, and you can carefully just open up some of those gaps a little bit just to get your scissors right in there. That's not a great scissors, but you get the idea. And just flattening it back out. And remember to just keep flipping the armature over. You can get into really awkward positions with the scissors, and sometimes just turning it over in your hand and a little bend on the wrist just opens up that seam for you to trim. So there's a little hole there, but it's not the end of the world because I am putting a second layer over the top of this. So I have my first layer in place, and you'll notice that I'm getting a hand shape. The fingers are quite skinny, and also you can very clearly see the wire through the fingers. So I'm just going to compress, squish all the way around, getting into the sides and rolling those fingers, getting right in and getting those seams really nice and neat. And again, take a little bit of time here. There's no rush. Once you're in place and you're happy, you want to do exactly the same process again. And if you remember, I said to keep the armature or the milliput flat. If there's any depth or bulk to the milliput, what you'll wind up with now is a little fat palm. So adding the bulk with the foam means that you want to try and keep those palms really flat when you're making them with the milliput. Because there's already a layer of foam on here, this sticks beautifully. So the shape will start to appear much, much faster because you've got that nice soft layer. But again, you'll notice that I just travel around all the way around the armature, and the tips of the fingers and in between the fingers are the two spots that are likely to have little gaps or holes in them if you don't really pay attention. So getting right in there all the way around, and again out with my scissors, and I'm using the straight scissors this time just to show that you can work with either type. Again, flipping it over, and just while I'm repeating the same process again, just to say that there's a series of other materials that you can bring in when you become good at this and you want to add more detail. There's a material called Muller, which is on the materials page, and it's a very, very thin foam. And generally speaking, I would finish off with a layer of flesh-coloured Muller, and that gives me my skin colour. So you can buy Muller in lots of different colours. You can also mix some paint through the latex to give you a flesh colour. I've not done it for this tutorial because in a workshop situation we just want to make a nice simple hand, but it's just about testing and experimenting with some different colour, different pigments, and then how you paint and how you apply to the surface. This may, for example, be an animal paw, and you might want it to be a dark brown or a green. So testing and experimenting with these little maquettes or these little prototypes helps you to build that repertoire up so that when you are making a finished puppet, you're able to match the skin colour to the face, to whatever material you're using. And you'll find on this layer it's easier because you've got more bulk behind the skin. There's a little bit more for the scissors to bite into. And again, if you're struggling with this stage, try swapping your scissors, steal somebody's who's somebody else has put theirs down, pick it up and steal it. So you really need to feel the difference if you've been using a rubbish scissors. And you can see now that this shape is coming on really nicely. And again, I'm just going to get in. But instead of squashing the whole thing here, I'm going to leave a little bit of bulk at the tops of the fingers. I want them to flare a bit. So I'm not squashing them in. And this is what I mean when I say you can sculpt this material. If you notice, those fingers have that nice little cartoon flare at the top, and that reads really nicely on camera. Now, I could squish these down, or these might get squished again in handling, but the last step is going to be to put a layer of latex over the top, and that will help to preserve the shape. So another little trick that I have is to trim away carefully so I don't cut the wire. I'm just cutting through those layers down to the wire. And this just gives me a little piece of wire sticking up. Now again, depending on the joining method, you may want lots of wire here. You may end the wire just shortly below the wrist. Depends on your puppet and the design. But having that little piece of wire at the end means I can handle it now. I've got something I can hold on to because the last stage is dipping. Now for larger puppets, you'd probably want to paint a layer of latex over the hand. But in a workshop situation, that does ruin a lot of brushes. You may also notice that I'm using the slightly sudsy latex from before. Again, in a workshop, that's absolutely fine. For a final puppet, I would be using clean latex straight out of the bottle. And this little material is neoprene. I think I've used it in an earlier tutorial. But the idea is that you can stick the wire into that, and it's great for just drying, to have something there that you can stick something into. So just dipping the hand, and again I want to just get the excess latex off before I set it to dry. We don't want drips and kind of lumpy bits ruining our lovely clean shape. So a little bit of acrylic paint in through here will give it a slight flesh tone. And oh, I should have cleaned that blob, but never mind. So now it's in place. And I can't stress the importance of prep enough, that having that ready rather than wandering around with latex dripping all over the place is really important. So that's now ready to it's drying at the moment, and just putting the lid on my latex. And I need to leave that to dry for a couple of hours. You'll notice that the latex will go brown and sort of clear, and then you're ready to move on to the next step. We are going to be looking at stop motion puppet making. So you know that the stop motion process is to move something a little bit, take a frame, move it a little bit, take a frame, move it a little bit, take a frame, and do that about 5,000 times, and you might get 3 or 4 good seconds of footage. So the internal structure needs to be flexible. It needs to be strong enough to support the skin, but flexible enough to create that movement. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but we're going to look at a really simple beginner's approach. We're going to be doing something today that's very similar to this purple puppet, except a different design and capable of that stop motion performance. So we're making a little hand today, and this is what the hand looks like on the inside. So you've been supplied with a pre-made armature. There are instructions on this website to show you how to make this if you're interested. You'll notice that the armature has a coating, and that's latex. The sheets that I've also supplied have been dipped in latex. So this should adhere quite well to our armature. And there's a couple of little strips also. Now these little strips are really to bulk out the wrist. So the first thing you'll need to do is to work out how much you're going to need to cover the arm, to make the arm wider, because obviously the wrist is a lot wider than the finger. So even in a cartoon character, we need to bulk that wrist out a little bit. So adding the foam, we want to leave a little piece of wire clear at the bottom, as I've just shown you there with the cocktail stick. So you want to leave a little bit of clear wire, it doesn't matter how much, and you'll see that the latex sticks really well. I'm wrapping it around 3 times. So this should give me a nice little bit of bulk. And then just bringing my nail scissors in, I'm just going to trim that off. Now the trim doesn't really matter. We're going to be putting some layers of skin over this. So don't worry if there's a little bit of a ridge there, we can get rid of that. So what we're looking for is something like that with a little piece of wire at the bottom, and we're ready to go. The next step is just spread the fingers out a little bit. We're going to be getting in between these fingers with the scissors. So if they're spread out, it makes it a bit easier. And taking your first piece of foam, we want to make a kind of a sandwich. Now this is actually quite a big piece of foam, so I'm going to, in this case, flip the foam over to make one kind of envelope. But if your hand armature is quite big, you can use two separate pieces. So I'm just going to flip that over. You'll see we've got a nice little package there. And now with my fingers, I'm just going to squeeze that foam, and you'll see very quickly that the shape of the hand will start to emerge. So the latex is kind of collapsing the foam, and what happens is you wind up, it's almost like a vac forming process. It's really important that you go around a few times with your fingers. It's the heat from your fingers and the pressure that really help to stick all that in place. So between the fingers, right down to that little hard white piece. And when you're happy that you've got it really, really well pressed down, you're going to come in with your scissors and you're going to start to trim. Now, some of the scissors are great, some of them less so. So I apologize if your scissors isn't good, but you want to try and get one that will cut quite cleanly. So any nail scissors will do. And you'll see that I'm just roughing out the shape, leaving a good bit of distance away from the wire. I don't want to go too close to the wire at this point. So I'm cutting out a kind of a flipper just to help me to get to some of those awkward angles. And remember, you can flip the hand over as well. So sometimes if you can't quite reach the bit you're trying to snip, just flipping it over makes it a lot easier. And you can see I'm leaving quite a little seam around the edge. Remember, that will squish down when we're finished this, so we can almost mold this material. So don't worry, it's better to have a little bit of a flashing or a seam around the edges. And I tend to go around in one direction when I'm doing the fingers. So if you watch the demo, I'll go around and right down to that little milliput center, that's that white material. Same again, right down with my scissors, keeping a little bit of distance from the wire, so you can clearly see there's a little bit of a seam, and just tidy that little edge up there, not too close. And I'm going to flip it over, pick away my little rough bits, and then the same thing. And I find that easier to just go in one direction first, flip it over and go back the other way. It's a little bit more methodical. And you can see that the fingers are quite rough in their shape, so don't worry too much if they're not 100% consistent in their width. So a little bit of a stretch there, don't pull too much, and we can just get that little tricky bit. And remember that the wire bends, so you can bend the wire to allow you to get into the shape a little bit more easily. So you can see there, I just bent the wire. Not too much because you'll actually put too much pressure on the material, but just to help you out. And now that I've got a rough shape, just pull it back a little bit off the tips there. There we go. A little bit of tidying up. And I'm just going to squish. And what happens is that the latex will close the cell structure. So the foam is full of air bubbles. The latex collapses those air bubbles and it stays collapsed. So it behaves like a kind of protoplasticine. You can almost sculpt with it. And if we go right in, we're going as close to the wire as we can. Now we could stop here, but you can clearly see the wire through the layer of foam. So I like to add at least 2 layers, and you can see there's a little gap there. I've actually got a little tear in the material, so a second layer is a good idea. Now, just to show that if you don't have enough to fold over, you can just use 2 pieces. So if we, and you see I place it near the bottom so that that piece of wire is sticking out. I could fold this one over, but just to show you, it's a bit wasteful, but just to show you. If your hand armature is quite big, you can just put the second piece over the top. And you'll find this time that because there's already a layer of foam, it sticks really quickly. And also we've got a nice bulk to the material now because you've got a bit of shape behind. So pinch, pinch, pinch. And again, time spent here is not a waste of time because the more pressure you put here, the less likely you are to have a little gap or a little tear in the material. So again, just going back around with the scissors, and while I'm just demonstrating the same process again, I'd just like to ask that you turn your attention to the Padlet, which is situated on the website just underneath these tutorials. And what we'd like you to do for today is think about ways you could just photograph these hands in different locations doing different and interesting things. And there is a way of taking a photograph using your phone directly onto the Padlet. So if you have a look, there should be a little uploader plus sign, and under there there's a camera icon, and that should allow you to take a photograph straight onto this. And hopefully at some point during the day we should be able to share those images out. If not during the day, we'll certainly get them back to the delegates after. And the most interesting photograph of the day is going to win a completed stop motion puppet, so something that looks a little bit like that monster character, the purple guy. So that's something to get you guys being creative. As we're just getting through the cutting stage, what I'd like to do now is just go back around again and pinch in, and because we now have a layer against that back layer, we can shape it a little bit. We can add a little bit more of a refined shape to this, tidying it up and just tucking away any little rough bits. And there we go, we've got a really nicely finished hand. Because all of your armatures are slightly different, all of your puppets' hands will be slightly different. So I'm just going to bring in a few more that I've finished. And again, the little metal piece at the bottom isn't important. If you don't have it, that's fine. And this is just one that's been dipped in latex after, and that just helps to give it a little bit of a skin. And just to finish up with where we started, so this is the same process, exactly the same materials, but made over a longer period of time, and that's my original little puppet hand. So hope you enjoyed the session.